Have you seen a person who starts out good but ends up bad? Hello, I'm Pastor Arnold Martin with the Word to You. It is sad to see a person with talent and ability who starts out well in their walk with God, but they end up bad. They do so well for a while, but things begin to go downhill and they disintegrate. Some become cold spiritually. Some go from apathy to depravity. Some go from destruction. And it's always sad when you see that. But what is it that causes the ruin of a Christian? Why do so many start out well and they end up bad? We can find out some answers as we look at the first king of Israel. No one had a better start than King Saul, but no one ended up any worse. Saul was a handsome, courteous, thoughtful, and humble man. He was, at least that's how it started. But in his last days, we see a murderous, envious, and a wicked man. What happened to this man who started out so well, but ended so bad? Probably nobody ever had a better start than Saul. As a matter of fact, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 2, it says this, speaking of Saul and his father Kish. It says in verse 2, it says, "And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man, and a goodly. And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward he was higher than any of the people." Here's a choice young man. That means he came from a godly family. He was tall. He was handsome. We could say he was a man among men. If he were here today, Hollywood would make a star out of him. But not only that, he was a humble man. When Samuel came to anoint him as king over Israel, it says in 1 Samuel 9:21, it says, "And Saul answered and said, Am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel? And my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Wherefore then speakest thou so to me?" He says, you can't be thinking about picking me to be your king. He feels so unworthy for the job. But not only that, he's chosen by God. And the Spirit of God comes upon him. And here's a man who is head and shoulders above everybody else. Physically, he's a handsome man, chosen by God. The Spirit of God came upon him. You don't get much better than that. But look in 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 6. It says, "And the Spirit of the Lord will come upon thee, and thou shalt prophesy with them, and shalt be turned into another man. And let it be, when these signs are come unto thee, that thou do as occasion serve thee, for God is with thee." What else could God have done for this man to make him successful? Well, look in 1 Samuel chapter 10, 26, and you'll see something. It says, "And Saul also went home to Gibeah, and there went with him a band of men whose hearts God had touched." God gave him some men to help him with the job that God had for him to do. He had a good attitude. And it's revealed when some bad people despise him. They say, "We don't want Saul to rule over us." Notice the good men's reaction, and then notice Saul's reaction in 1 Samuel 11:12. It says, "And the people said unto Samuel, Who is he that saith, shall Saul reign over us? Bring them in that we may put them to death. And Saul said, There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel." One word from Saul, and these men would have been history. But Saul is doing good to those who hate him. What a great moral strength he had at the beginning. In addition to that, God gave him Samuel as his spiritual mentor. to guide him. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 25. It says, Then Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. Here's Samuel telling Saul what he's to do and not do. Samuel said, Saul, God's chosen you. He's chosen you to be king. He's put His Spirit upon you. God has gifted you. God's given you some men who will follow after you. And then here is God's plan. I've written it for you in a book. Samuel wrote it all down. So Saul had all of God's directions with him. What an opportunity to bless the nation and to bless the world. Saul had both ability and the opportunity to be the greatest king the world had ever seen. No man had a better start, and no man had a sadder finish. What happened? How did this man self-destruct? Let's see if we can learn some valuable lessons from the life of King Saul. First, I want you to notice, as with any sinful behavior, it began small. The Philistines came to fight with Israel, had a huge army. 1 Samuel 13:6, it shows Israel's army is running, they're hiding everywhere they could hide, running from the battle. Verse 7 says, the people followed Saul trembling. And verse 8 says this, And he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offerings. And it came to pass that as soon as he hath made an end of offering, the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash, therefore said I, The Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I've not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. Friends, this shows a man relying on his wisdom rather than relying on the Spirit of God in him. He's walking in the flesh. He does a holy thing with his own ability, by his own wisdom, and by his own will. Friend, Satan knows he cannot get a godly person to go into adultery or into drugs or start stealing money. He's too strong for that. If many of us were tempted to do bad things in the flesh, we could see through that. We wouldn't fall for that temptation. So the devil says, if I can't get him to do bad things in the flesh, I'll get him to do good in the flesh. That's a lot easier. I'll get him to minister in the flesh or to sing in the flesh. I'll get him to do good from their own strength. Friends, when I talk about the flesh, I'm not talking about skin and bones. I'm talking about the old Adam nature that we were born with. If we do good things, but we are doing it not depending on God for wisdom and strength, we're in the flesh. Friends, the flesh can sing a song, or teach a lesson, or preach a sermon, or give a big gift. The flesh can do all those good things, and people may see it and they'll say, man, isn't he gifted? Isn't he wonderful? He's not doing bad in the flesh. He's doing good in the flesh. But he's still in the flesh. And that's what Saul was doing. He was out of the will of God. He was doing holy things, offering a sacrifice, but doing it of his own wit and will and ingenuity, and he was violating God's law. He's not doing the bad things. He's just doing good things, but he's in the flesh. Friends, please learn this great truth. Once the devil gets anyone doing good in the flesh, it will not be long before he will start doing bad in the flesh. Why? Because that which is flesh is flesh. All Satan has to do is to gently move us into the area of the flesh. He doesn't care whether you're in the flesh in church or in the flesh in the gutter. Once you are in the flesh, you stop depending on God. And you are in the devil's domain. That's what happened to Saul. Samuel said, Saul, you're being so foolish. When we see someone who seems to have fallen suddenly into some sin, he didn't fall suddenly. Friends, there was a gradual slowing down until he was doing good in the flesh, and then he's in Satan's domain, and then it is a very small step from there to doing bad in the flesh. Satan can't force you, but he can gently influence you as he did Saul, so that this anointed, this God-gifted, this man blessed by God, this God-equipped man begins to rely on his own wisdom, his own will, rather than the Holy Spirit. So that now he's running ahead of God. He's acting foolishly. He's acting without God's direction. It seemed good to offer a sacrifice, but in doing so, he violated a command of God. And it's never right to do wrong to get to do right. So first, King Saul begins to do spiritual things with his wit and his will in the flesh. Then he goes from doing good in the flesh to doing bad in the flesh. In chapter 15, you see a stubborn disobedience. Saul's given a command by God to utterly destroy the Amalekites. Look in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 2, it says, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. You say, man alive, is that cruel? Well, it'd be cruel if we had commanded it. But friends, God is righteous. And all God does or brings or allows is right. This is the judgment of God on a group of people who had become a cancer in the human race. They were a bandit race. They slaughtered and they raped, they tortured people. They had no use for sacred things. They oppressed weaker people, and they were demon worshipers. This was a merciful thing, really, that God did. First, it kept them from committing more sin, and the little children who would die would go to heaven rather than grow up to be a demon-inspired people. So God said to Saul, utterly destroy them. But what does Saul do? He spares the king of the Amalekites, Agag. He takes of the best of the sheep and oxen that God said to destroy. When Samuel comes on the scene, he asks King Saul, did you do what God told you to do? Oh, yes, Samuel, buddy, I did that. I sure did. Samuel says, no, you didn't. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 19. Wherefore, then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but didst fly upon the spoil, and didst evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said unto Samuel, Yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. And then he begins to blame his sin on someone else. Look in verse 21. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. Now, friends, here's one of the great verses of the Bible, verse 22. And Samuel said, Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. And then here's a great warning in verse 23. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Friends, when we sin against God, God calls it rebellion and witchcraft, iniquity and idolatry. When parents allow their children to rebel against them, they are allowing witchcraft to be practiced in their homes. Friends, sin is never static. So here is Saul. First, he begins to do good things in the flesh, offering the sacrifice. He's running ahead of God instead of obeying God, but he's doing it in the flesh. But secondly, he is deliberately and stubbornly disobeying God. This is doing bad in the flesh. God told him plainly what to do, and he refused to do it. Now notice excuses. Oh, I'm not going to destroy the sheep. Hey, I'm going to offer them to God. Sounded good. Sounded reasonable and logical. It sounded economic. It even sounded spiritual. But God would say, are you going to take that which I told you to destroy and offer them to me for sacrifice? Friends, that doesn't make a lick of sense. One thing God will never accept for disobedience is an alibi or an excuse. So here's Saul. First, he's running ahead of God, doing good in the flesh. Then he's deliberately disobeying God, doing bad in the flesh. But it always gets worse. The third thing we find Saul doing is now he's fighting against God. God has said, don't want Saul to be king anymore. I'll get me another king. And God tells Samuel to go anoint one of the sons of Jesse as the new king. Of course, that was David. In 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, notice what the Bible says here. It says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. Now, David is God's anointed king. But notice verse 14. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. The evil spirit that came to Saul was brought on him by God himself. God controls the good angels, and God controls the evil angels or demons as well. So God is sending righteous judgment. He sends a strong delusion. By the way, he's going to do that in the last days so that men will believe a lie. Why would God do that? So they would all be damned because they didn't heed to the law of God. Now, notice in chapter 18, David now is the anointed king of God. But in 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 7, notice what it says. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth. And the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. What can he have more but the kingdom? you see how jealousy begins to eat at Saul. And he begins to hate God's anointed. And then he sets out to kill God's anointed king. Look in 1 Samuel 18:11. It says, and Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of the presence twice. David was God's anointed king now. So here's a man, greatly gifted, anointed of God, filled with the Spirit of God, had people to help him, had everything made kingly, but now he begins to do good in the flesh. And then he begins to disobey God, doing bad in the flesh. And now here you see him fighting against God. Now he's trying to destroy God's anointed. Friends, but sin is not finished with King Saul yet. It keeps going downward. The next step after fighting against God is cooperating with the devil. Remember Samuel had said that rebellion and disobedience is as a sin of witchcraft. When you disobey, you sin. All sin is brought on by pride. That's when you think you know better than God. But when you get in the flesh, that puts you in the devil's territory. Before long, you find yourself conniving with and connecting with the devil. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 28 and verse 7. And Saul, then said Saul unto his servants, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. Know what a familiar spirit is? That's a demon. This woman was a witch. Now this mighty man, this man that had run this kind of thing out of the kingdom before, now is going to her for help. Now he's trafficking with the underworld. He's taking counsel from hell. He's gone from ignoring God to disobeying God to fighting with God to cooperating with the devil. Let's look at the final chapter of his life. There's a battle, and King Saul's son Jonathan was killed. Israel is being defeated. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 31 and verse 3. It says, and the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hid him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor bearer, draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. His faithful band of men whose hearts God had touched, they were in retreat. The vile, wicked enemies of Israel that Saul was to defeat, they're winning the battle against God's people. This man, who had such a great start, is now trying to kill himself by his own hands. Falls on his sword, self-destruction. Well, that's the story. The final end is when an Amalekite comes along and ends up killing King Saul. You know, this seems like poetic justice. God said to destroy the Amalekites, but Saul had other plans. And now an Amalekite ends up killing him. No man ever had a better start. No man ever had a sadder ending. Let me give you 5 things to think about as we think about this story. The first thing is, circumstances cannot make you, nor can circumstances break you. If circumstances could have made a man, Saul would have made it. No man had better circumstances than Saul. If circumstances could break a man, David would have never made it. But David did make it, and Saul didn't. So if you are in good circumstances, don't throw back your shoulders and think you're always going to be sailing along high, wide, and handsome. Because if your circumstances seem to be against you, just remember that if God be for you, friends, it doesn't matter who's against you. The second thing is, be careful that you don't find yourself doing good in the flesh. That's the heart of the message. Don't do what you do for God without depending on God rather than your will. Don't do good in the flesh. The third thing is, there can be no success without obedience. Disobedience is not only disobedience. Friends, it's rebellion, it's witchcraft, and God cannot bless that. The fourth principle is that success now does not mean success always. Our ambition should be to finish well. Remember, if you're running a race, no matter how far ahead you may be, friends, you're going to lose if you quit running. Success now does not mean success always. If you're in the flesh and you still think you're successful, you're deceived. If you're in the Spirit and you think it'll be automatic, again, you're deceived. There's no greater person than the Apostle Paul, but he said this, I keep under my body, I keep it in subjection, lest that when I preach to others, I myself should be a castaway. Paul knew that it was only one step from doing good in the Spirit or doing good in the flesh. The fifth principle is this, no one is immune to the deceiving and deadening power of sin. Nobody who is self-willed can ever be Spirit-filled. And that's a big lesson for us. We need to continually pray that we might walk with God in humility, and that we serve God with joy in the strength of His Spirit, and to obey the Lord in all things. So these are the key points. Be careful about this. Be careful about doing good in the flesh. That's running ahead of God. Be careful about stubborn disobedience. That's doing bad in the flesh. And then be careful about that which leads you to fighting against God. And number 4, be careful about that which leads you to cooperating with the devil, which can lead to self-destruction. Friends, remember this. Circumstances can't make you, and circumstances cannot break you. Be careful to not do good in the flesh. Remember that there is no success without obedience. Remember that success now does not mean success always. And remember that no one is immune to the deceiving and deadening power of sin. And remember that nobody, that is nobody, can be Spirit-filled if they're walking in the flesh. You cannot be. No one is immune to the deceiving and deadening power of sin. And nobody who is self-willed can be Spirit-filled. Until next week, may God richly bless you.